What if the methods your grandparents used to stay warm were actually more scientifically advanced than anything modern heating technology has produced? That sounds like a stretch, right? But researchers studying traditional Chinese thermal management techniques have been publishing some genuinely surprising findings, and the conclusions are forcing a lot of experts to rethink what they dismissed as folk superstition for decades. Today, we are counting down 20 traditional Chinese heating practices that were once ridiculed, banned, or forgotten, and that scientists are now calling quietly brilliant. Stay with me because number one on this list is going to completely change how you think about body heat. Number 20, the Kang bed system. In northern China, particularly across Manchuria and the Loess Plateau regions, families slept on a raised platform called a kang, which translates directly as a heated brick bed. The kang was connected to the household cooking stove by a series of underground flue channels, meaning the waste heat from preparing dinner would radiate upward through the sleeping surface for hours after the meal was finished. Colonial-era hygienists and later Soviet-influenced urban planners deemed this system primitive and a fire hazard, pushing families toward radiator-based central heating during modernization campaigns. Here is what researchers now understand. The Kang delivers radiant heat directly to the human body at the lowest possible point, which is the sleeping zone, rather than heating the air near the ceiling where heat escapes fastest. A 2019 thermal efficiency study found that Kang-style radiant floor systems use roughly 40% less energy than forced air equivalents for the same perceived thermal comfort level. The body does not need a warm room. The body needs a warm surface in contact with skin. The Chinese figured that out centuries before anyone wrote a thermodynamics textbook, and the next trick takes that idea of body contact heating even further, in a way that sounds almost medieval until you understand the biology. Number 19, hot stone compress therapy called Ri-Fu. Ri-Fu, meaning hot compress or warm application, involved heating specific river stones or carved soapstone pieces in low embers, and wrapping them in layered cloth for placement against the lower back, feet, or abdomen during cold seasons. This was simultaneously a medical practice and a household heating strategy, blurring the line between personal warmth and therapeutic intervention. Regulatory bodies across Asia during the 20th century increasingly classified unofficial thermal therapies as pseudo-medicine, discouraging their use in favor of pharmaceutical approaches to cold-induced ailments. What modern sports medicine and pain management researchers have confirmed is that localized heat application to the lumbar region increases peripheral circulation significantly, reduces shivering response duration, and actually allows the body to maintain core temperature more efficiently than whole room heating alone. The stones chosen were not random either. Soapstone has one of the highest specific heat capacities of any common rock, meaning it absorbs enormous amounts of thermal energy and releases it slowly and evenly for extended periods. What seems like folk superstition turns out to be materials science applied centuries before the discipline existed. Stay with me because number 18 involves something you probably have in your kitchen right now, being used in a way that will completely change how you think about it. Number 18. Salt heating pouches called yan ridai. The yan ridai, which translates to salt heating bag, was a simple cloth pouch filled with coarse rock salt that had been heated in a dry pan over a stove. Salt has exceptional thermal mass for its weight and, crucially, does not transfer heat as aggressively as water does, making it feel warm for longer without the burning risk associated with hot water bottles. These were banned in several institutional settings in 20th century China because of concerns about burns and unsanitary conditions in crowded dormitories and hospitals. Contemporary thermal therapy researchers have now validated the specific thermal conductivity profile of sodium chloride as nearly ideal for sustained low-intensity heat delivery. The salt pouch maintains temperatures in a therapeutically useful range between 40 and 55 degrees Celsius, for significantly longer than most synthetic heating pads without requiring electricity or chemical reactions. Several hospitals in Japan and South Korea have reintroduced variations of this method in their palliative care wards, specifically because it outperforms electronic heating pads on patient comfort metrics. The next trick is even older than salt pouches and uses something that most people in the modern world literally throw in the trash every single day: Number 17, rice hull bed warmers called mi-ke-rei. Mi-ke-rei, loosely translated as rice husk heat, describes a practice common across Hunan, Jiangxi, and Fujian provinces where dried rice hulls were packed into ceramic or clay vessels, partially combusted to a slow, smoldering state, and placed beneath bed frames or inside bed tents during winter nights. The smoldering hulls produce minimal visible flame and generate a sustained, low-temperature radiant output that could last 6 to 8 hours. 20th century fire safety regulations and indoor air quality standards rightly flagged the carbon monoxide risk from poorly ventilated versions of this practice, and many communities were told to abandon it entirely. However, materials engineers studying biomass combustion have since documented that rice hulls have an extraordinarily low combustion rate when partially oxygen-starved, producing heat at a remarkably stable and predictable output for their mass and volume. Modern biochar researchers are now designing low-emission smoldering heat devices based on the same physical principles, essentially re-engineering the MIKE-RE for the 21st century with proper ventilation design. The genius was always in the material choice. Up next is a trick involving clothing that sounds completely counterintuitive when you first hear it described. Number 16. Reverse sheepskin layering called fan pai ao. Fan pai ao describes the ancient practice of wearing sheepskin or goat hide with the fleece turned inward against the body rather than outward as a display surface, a practice common in Xinjiang, Gansu, and Qinghai regions. Officialdom during various dynastic periods and later modernization campaigns pushed back against this as unhygienic and barbaric looking, preferring woven wool garments as signs of civilization. Textile engineers studying insulation principles now recognize that inward-facing fleece creates a trapped air layer directly against the skin that is far superior to outward-facing fur for thermal retention in dry, cold conditions. The irregular fiber structure of natural fleece facing the body creates thousands of tiny convection-resistant pockets that woven fabric cannot replicate regardless of thickness. Arctic survival research conducted in Canada and Norway has essentially confirmed what Xinjiang herders knew intuitively. Skin-side fleece wins against almost every other passive insulation strategy in extreme cold. Number 15 involves water, but not the way you expect, and the timing element is the truly clever part. Number 15. Pre-dawn footbath sequencing called Chen Zhao Pao Jiao. Chen Zhao Pao translates to early morning foot soaking and describes the practice of submerging the feet in progressively cooler water baths beginning before sunrise during winter months, starting at around 42 degrees Celsius and cooling incrementally over a 30-minute period. Traditional Chinese medicine practitioners prescribe this sequence as a way to prepare the body's thermal regulation system for the cold of the day ahead. Western medical authorities throughout the 20th century categorize this alongside other TCM practices as lacking scientific foundation. What vascular physiology research has since established is that cyclical thermal stimulation of the feet, which contain an unusually dense network of arteriovenous anastomoses, trains peripheral vasoconstriction and dilation responses and measurably reduces the core temperature drop that typically occurs during cold exposure. Athletes in military cold weather training programs have independently developed almost identical protocols through a completely different research pathway. The folk knowledge and the laboratory data converged on the same answer from opposite directions. Number 14 is going to be one that surprises you because it involves architecture rather than objects or clothing. Number 14. South-facing earth berm dwellings called Xiangyang Tu-ju. Xiangyang Tu-ju means south-facing earth dwelling, referring to the traditional construction practice in northern Chinese regions of partially embedding homes into hillsides on a specific southeastern exposure, with a wide, low-angle window facade facing solar south. These Yaodong-style cave houses were considered relics of poverty by 20th century urban planners and were systematically replaced with concrete block housing in development campaigns across Shaanxi and Shaanxi provinces. Passive solar architecture researchers have since calculated that a properly oriented Xiangyang Tuju maintains interior temperatures roughly 15 degrees Celsius warmer than ambient outdoor conditions without any active heating source whatsoever. The Earth mass acts as a thermal battery, absorbing solar energy during daylight hours and releasing it slowly through the night, a concept that now commands enormous attention in sustainable building design. Several European passive house research institutes have essentially rebuilt these Chinese earthworm principles from scratch using computational fluid dynamics and finite element thermal modeling, arriving at near-identical geometric proportions to what village builders had worked out empirically. The next one is a trick involving cooking and space heating simultaneously that the efficiency numbers make genuinely shocking. Number 13. Integrated stove wall heating called huoqiang. Huoqiang means firewall and describes a construction technique where the household cooking stove was integrated directly into the masonry of the interior wall, with the flue pathway snaking horizontally through the wall thickness before exiting at the roofline. This meant that every cooking session simultaneously heated the thermal mass of the wall itself, which then radiated stored heat into the room for hours afterward. Housing authorities condemned these systems throughout the 20th century as fire risks and demolition hazards. Energy analysts who have studied surviving huoqiang systems in rural Hebei and Liaoning have measured them capturing between 60 and 75% of combustion heat that conventional separate stove and chimney configurations simply exhaust into the sky. The physics here is the same physics that drives modern condensing boilers and waste heat recovery systems worth billions of dollars in industrial applications. Ancient builders understood that every pathway heat travels through the structure is a pathway heat stays in the structure. Number 12 involves something that sounds spiritually motivated, but turns out to have a hard physiological explanation. Number 12. Cold room sleeping ritual called Hanshi Shui Mian. Hanshi Shui Mian, cold room sleep, was a documented practice in certain Buddhist monastic traditions and also among some Han Chinese households where the sleeping room was intentionally kept significantly cooler than the living space, with heavy bedding providing the insulation layer. Health authorities during various reform movements criticized this as a cause of respiratory illness and exposure risk. Sleep science has since established that core body temperature must drop by approximately 1 degree Celsius for deep sleep onset to occur, and that sleeping in an overly warm room suppresses the slow-wave sleep stages associated with cellular repair and immune function. The cold room sleepers were essentially engineering the ideal thermal environment for sleep quality without knowing the neuroscience, relying instead on observations across generations that people who slept in colder rooms felt more restored and got sick less often. Stanford University sleep researchers published findings in the past decade that essentially validate the cold sleeping room practice as optimal for sleep architecture. Number 11 involves a material combination that sounds like a recipe rather than a heating technology. Number 11. Clay and straw wall insulation, called Ni Kao Tu Chiang. Ni Kao Tu Chiang means clay straw earth wall and describes the traditional Chinese construction method of mixing locally excavated clay with chopped straw or rice stalks and pressing this composite into thick wall sections. Development campaigns throughout the mid-20th century associated these walls with rural backwardness and replaced them with thin concrete and brick construction that was seen as modern. Building physicists studying thermal mass and vapor permeability have now measured traditional Naikao Tu-Chiang walls at insulation values comparable to or exceeding modern cavity wall constructions, while simultaneously managing interior humidity levels far more effectively than concrete. The straw fibers create a cellular structure that traps enormous volumes of dead air, and the clay's hygroscopic properties mean the walls actively absorb and release moisture to buffer against the condensation that makes cold walls feel colder than their actual temperature. The hempcrete and straw bale construction movements sweeping Europe and North America are direct contemporary descendants of this principle. Number 10 is genuinely strange sounding, but has a straightforward physics explanation that makes it hard to argue with. Number 10. Window draft deflectors called fengban. Fengban, meaning windboards or draft panels, were interior wooden or woven panels positioned at specific angles near window and door openings to redirect incoming cold drafts upward toward the ceiling, rather than allowing them to flow at body level across the floor. Architectural standardization movements dismissed these as unsightly obstructions and removed them from housing designs. Modern HVAC engineers now spend considerable resources designing diffuser angles to achieve exactly this effect in high-end climate-controlled buildings. The Fungbon were achieving the same result with a piece of shaped wood and empirical observation. Number 9 involves fire timing. That sounds trivial but carries real consequences for fuel efficiency. Number 9, staggered fire timing, called kuo shi sheng huo. Kuo shi sheng huo translates as offset time fire lighting, describing the village practice in colder regions of staggering the times when neighboring households lit their cooking and heating fires across a 2-hour window, rather than simultaneously. Collective heating mandates during certain communist-era administrative periods eliminated this practice in favor of synchronized community heating schedules. Environmental fluid dynamics research has shown that when multiple heat sources in a dense residential area fire simultaneously, the resulting thermal plume interference actually reduces effective heat retention in individual structures through altered convective patterns around building envelopes, while staggered firing allows each structure to benefit from slightly warmed neighboring air without the disruption of competing plume columns. This sounds abstract, but the measurable fuel savings documented in traditional village configurations versus synchronized urban block heating are significant. Number 8 is one that no one would guess involves physics rather than medicine. Number 8. Layered paper clothing insulation called zhi ya paper garment describes the documented Chinese practice of wearing layers of treated or waxed paper between outer and inner garments as a winter insulation layer, practiced particularly among lower-income households in Song and Ming dynasty periods, and surviving into the early 20th century before being banned as a fire risk and hygiene concern in institutional settings. Materials engineers studying thermal insulation now recognize that thin-layered air gaps separated by low-conductivity membranes, which is exactly what layered paper creates, outperform single-thick insulation layers by disrupting convective transfer pathways. This is the same physical principle behind modern multi-layer space blankets and aerogel composite insulation used in extreme cold weather military gear. Number 7 involves your body's own heat, used against itself in the most counterintuitive way. Number 7. Localized sweating rooms called zheng fang. Zheng fang, steam room, small versions of which existed as household features rather than public bathing facilities in certain northern Chinese traditions, involved brief exposure to steam heat followed by immediate rest in heavily blanketed beds. Colonial health authorities classified home steam rooms as unsanitary and overcrowded, discouraging their construction in modernization drives. Physiologists now recognize that the post-steam vasodilation effect dramatically increases peripheral blood flow and allows the body to redistribute heat from core to extremities far more effectively than passive warming alone, meaning a brief zheng fang session creates a physiological heating effect that persists for hours through endogenous circulation rather than requiring continued external heat. Numbers 6 through 1 accelerate through territory that gets progressively harder to believe, but each one has a published study behind it. Number 6. Animal fat skin sealing called zhifu. Zhifu, fat skin application, involved applying rendered animal fat to exposed skin on the face and hands before venturing into cold conditions, a practice common in nomadic and semi-nomadic Chinese communities that was discouraged by both hygienic modernism and later cosmetic industry standardization. Dermatological research confirms that an occlusive fat layer reduces transepidermal water loss dramatically in cold, dry air, and that thermal comfort on exposed skin is partially a function of moisture loss rate rather than just temperature. Number 5. Underground food storage as thermal anchor called di xia ku. Di xia ku means underground storage, and communities that maintained root cellars below their homes discovered that these subterranean spaces maintained temperatures between 8 and 12 degrees Celsius regardless of surface conditions. and that connecting living spaces to this thermal anchor through managed ventilation pathways effectively buffered indoor temperatures. Building scientists call this earth coupling, and it is currently one of the most actively studied passive heating strategies in sustainable architecture. Number 4. Midnight fire reduction called Zhijianhuo. Zhijianhuo, midnight fire reduction, refers to the practice of deliberately reducing combustion intensity at the midnight hour, corresponding to the Z hour in traditional Chinese timekeeping, because experienced firekeepers observed that human sleep quality improved and fuel consumption dropped without measurable comfort loss when heat output was stepped down during the deepest sleep window. Sleep thermophysiology researchers have confirmed that this window corresponds exactly to the biological temperature nadir when external heat demand from the sleeping body is at its minimum. Number 3. Humidity-raising wet cloth racks called Shibujia. Shibujia wet cloth racks placed near heat sources raised room humidity deliberately during dry winter heating seasons. Thermodynamic comfort research confirms that higher humidity raises the apparent temperature by several degrees through its effect on evaporative heat loss from skin, meaning the same fuel input felt warmer in humid conditions than dry ones. Number 2. Communal body heat rooms called Zhunuan. Zhunuan, meaning gathered warmth, involved multiple family members sharing a single intentionally small room during peak cold, a practice discouraged by 20th century health authorities concerned about respiratory transmission. Thermal modeling shows that human metabolic heat output in a small, well-insulated space is sufficient to maintain comfortable temperatures, with a dramatically less fuel expenditure than heating larger separate rooms. And number 1, the empty center courtyard thermal chimney called Tianjing. Tianjing means skywell, describing the narrow central courtyard in traditional Chinese residential compounds that functions as a passive thermal chimney, drawing cold air from outside, warming it along sun-exposed masonry surfaces, and allowing it to rise naturally through the central opening, while pulling warmer stratified air downward along interior walls into living spaces. Urban planners demolished Tianjing courtyard compounds across Chinese cities throughout the 20th century in favor of apartment blocks that required mechanical heating to achieve the same effect. Computational fluid dynamics studies have now measured the Tianjing achieving natural thermal stratification that reduces cold air infiltration in surrounding rooms by up to 30% compared to equivalent open-plan structures. Every single one of these 20 techniques was either dismissed, discouraged, or outright banned at some point in modern history. Every single one has now been validated by at least one published scientific study. The real lesson is not that the past knew better than the present. The real lesson is that empirical knowledge accumulated over centuries deserves rigorous examination rather than reflexive dismissal. Sometimes genius looks like a warm stone under a blanket,